Tonight on Nation to Nation, the Supreme Court ruled there is underfunding of police services in a northern Quebec First Nation. The president of the First Nations Chiefs of Police hopes governments will now negotiate better funding.
There's no meaningful negotiations that take place, and that's one of the faults that they saw in this decision.
Chief Patricia Bernard says the Wolastoqey are not coming after individual private landowners in New Brunswick. This is after a court ruling said private property can be part of Aboriginal title claims.
So it's not going to affect the everyday property owner, and these are not the people we're trying to seek land back from.
Saskatchewan's throne speech failed to mention Indigenous people. One NDP MLA says that neglect is typical in the province.
17 years with the Sask Party government, and we're still lacking the services needed in the north and the Indigenous community.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. The Supreme Court of Canada issued a big decision about First Nations policing this week. Canada's top court ruled the Quebec government breached the principle of good faith and failed to uphold the honour of the Crown when it came to funding police services for the Pequot-May-Olnuch First Nation between 2013 to 2017. The provincial government must now pay close to $768,000 to the Northern Quebec First Nation. But could this decision finally get government to fund First Nations policing adequately? Joining us now to talk about the decision is the president of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, Gerald Swamp. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Mr. Swamp.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess the first question I have is I know the decision is quite big, but you had a bit to review it. What's your initial thoughts on it?
First, I'd like to commend the Supreme Court of Canada for recognizing that the agreements involving Indigenous communities are not just legal documents, but they're deeply tied to the honor of the Crown. And that was pretty evident when honor of the Crown is the main issue of it. And that the trust requests the support of self-determination and public safety in Indigenous communities. So I think it's going to make a major impact on future negotiations, not only for the Quebec Peace Service, but also all the standalone police services across Canada.
Now, of course, the issue was shortfalls and not sort of funding not keeping up with costs. Is that a real problem that policing is getting more expensive over the last few years?
I think what we're looking at is this year, policing has gone up from anywhere from 15 to 30%. And that's right across Canada, not only in First Nation communities. But when we're dealing in First Nation communities, we're dealing with a higher violent crime index in our communities. And until recently, we weren't allowed to have specialized services in our communities. So we're doing a whole lot with a lot less.
And the decision actually, it's one specific northern Quebec community, but of course, as you know, there's still no federal legislation or new federal legislation as promised by the Prime Minister, I think back in 2020, on First Nations policing. So does it really solve the ongoing problem of sustainable funding for First Nations policing that at the current time seems to remain uncertain?
But one of the concerns that I have is that they looked at the years 2013 and 2017 for this community. But since 1991, there have been hundreds of First Nation policing agreements that have lacked the honor of the Crown within them. And many of our services, many of our leaders and our First Nation police leaders, as well as our community leaders, we feel the frustration that when the government comes to us with a funding agreement and says, this is what we think that you need to sustain policing in your community, there's no meaningful negotiations that take place. And that's one of the faults that they saw in this decision. So I'm hoping that in the ongoing future that the negotiations will change for our communities. Our communities and our leaders and our police chiefs, we know what needs to be done in our communities. But when we take our list to our funders, they make a decision unilaterally and they say, this is what we think that you need. And a lot of it is really lacking. And in the Quebec case, it showed that not only that by the refusal to negotiate, they showed that it not only did it hurt them financially, but also hurt the quality of policing that they're able to provide for their service. And that goes for all of our police services in Canada. Currently, we have 36 standalone First Nation police services in Canada, and we police over 150 communities. So that's 150 communities that don't have the quality of policing that they deserve because of lack of resources.
Now, I was reading an article in, I think it was Policy Options yesterday, saying it talked about there is a draft for the promised legislation on essential First Nations policing as essential service that the Prime Minister promised. But they were saying that one of the problems is it doesn't sort of put, sort of say federal jurisdiction by that First Nations jurisdiction over policing, but it remains a sort of a shared responsibility between the provinces and the federal government, and that they should, what the article was saying is it should be all under both the federal government and First Nations, and this leads to sort of funding shortfalls on both sides. So what's your thoughts on the current funding split?
Canada has the fiduciary responsibility for First Nations, and that includes policing. But the policing is also a provincial responsibility. So that's why we enter into both Canada and the provinces. And I tried to get them to split the negotiations into a funding agreement and then a policing agreement over who has responsibilities. But with the essential service legislation that's should be coming to fruition, hopefully, but we haven't seen a draft. They haven't produced a draft to any of our services or our community leaders. We're hoping that our leaderships and our communities have spoken very loudly and very clearly over the last year in the consultation process that they want to see the jurisdiction remain within the communities. And I think that's the impasse that they're having right now in this essential service legislation.
Have you had any recent talks with the public safety minister on when they might table this legislation? Or do you think there's any chance it could still come before an election, whenever that is?
I have my doubts that it'll come before election because there's nothing even drafted for it. I know they have been working on the principles of it, both public safety as well as AFN. Public safety minister hasn't reached out to the First Nations Police Association. We have been in discussions with the national leader of AFN, and it's been pretty good. And I think that going forward, there's going to be a lot more movement on it. But I sincerely doubt that anything will become drafted or we'll see anything on paper before the next election.
Right, you're probably accurate there. There's even concerns about existing legislation. Of course, there's been filibustering going on in the Commons every day here since they came back, and it's full-scale election mode. So I think your assessment is fairly accurate. But unfortunately, we'll have to end it there for time purposes. But as always, thanks for talking to us, Mr. Swamp.
Thank you. See you next time.
Up next, we'll talk to Chief Patricia Bernard of Wolastoqey Nation at Madawaska about another court decision that upholds First Nations rights claims on privately owned land in New Brunswick. Welcome back. There are new developments in the Wolastoqey Aboriginal Title Claim lawsuit. After Court of Queen's Bench, Justice Catherine Gregory ruled earlier this month Indigenous title can be declared over privately owned land. New Brunswick Attorney General Rob McKee has called for a pause on the case to pursue negotiations. The lawsuit was filed in 2021 by 6 Wolastoqey chiefs against the provincial and federal governments and industry. The claim covers over half of the province of New Brunswick. Chief Patricia Bernard of the Wolastoqey Nation at Madawaska joins me today to talk about the case and what it means. Chief Bernard, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much.
All right, so Justice Gregory ruled Aboriginal title can be declared over privately owned lands, but landowners cannot necessarily be sued. Could you maybe explain this for our viewers?
Sure. Obviously, title is a huge issue that we've brought against the Crown. And so the decision actually strengthens that whole relationship on nation to nation. So this is why we're bringing these claims against the government, but not naming private property owners and only naming some industrial defendants as they received large tracts of land that for pennies, so to speak, that the government didn't necessarily have the right to grant away. And so those were the only private property that we were seeking back was from these industrial defendants. But the actual declaration of title has to come from the Crown. So the decision was really about that.
Okay, and obviously there's land claims and First Nations pursuing them in the courts or with governments all across the country, of course, not just in New Brunswick. But what do you think the national implications for First Nations across the country may be because of this ruling?
Well, it's precedent setting in that it's basically saying that, yes, Aboriginal title can coexist with privately owned property. And so it's precedent setting across the country in that the law of Aboriginal title is evolving and changing. And so it has national implications in that sense. So it's exciting to know that the courts are understanding and diving into the actual legal concept of Aboriginal title and how it can exist and when it was extinguished or when it wasn't, or if it wasn't. So.
Now, as we were just talking, the lead up as well is that First Nations have often pursued these claims or negotiations in general to federal and provincial governments on a sort of nation-to-nation basis. The Crown hasn't always wanted to negotiate on in that way, and it hasn't always been deemed by the court to be seen in that way. This appears to say that these sort of situations and claims should be decided on a nation-to-nation basis. How exactly significant is that?
Well, that's huge because again, every time these decisions come out, the courts are constantly requesting that the government stop litigating and start negotiating these because the law is there and it's Canadian law and it's on the Indigenous side when it comes to recognition of title. And and we're quite happy, I think, that the province has reached out to try and negotiate these things, which we've been waiting for because litigation isn't really good for anyone, except possibly for the fact that it does set precedents and guidelines moving forward. And the responsibility of the Crown is there to reach out to First Nations and to sit down and talk about these things, deal with it. It's not new. That's not new. I mean, it's happened across in the western part of this country, and it can definitely happen here in the East. So we're looking forward to that.
And also, there, of course, is a new Liberal government in place after the election. How confident are you that negotiations can move forward in a way that best meets the needs of the Quebec Nation?
Well, so far, we've seen a great movement on the new government here to sit down and talk to us. They've already they've made many campaign promises, and as soon as they've taken over, they've reached out to the First Nations, and we're quite hopeful and positive that this government will successfully negotiate these things out of litigation anyway.
Right, I guess it remains to be seen, but some good messages, I guess, off the bat from the new Premier, Susan Holt. As we discussed also in the lead up, these rulings can be complicated and sometimes spun different ways in the media. Of course, I know they're in sort of the Conservatives have taken a bit of a different tact on it, and there was concerns being voiced from small private landowners that this meant that they were going to lose their land or they could be kicked off their land. But I understand that's not really what this is about. Maybe you could just explain a bit for our viewers what sort of lands the Quebec Nation is really interested on laying title claim to?
Well, we're interested in a declaration of title to all of our traditional territory. And with respect to New Brunswick, the traditional territory that lies within that province. So we are seeking a declaration for the areas that are outlined in the map that we've filed. But this isn't going to affect private property owners, and that's the beauty of this decision, because the decision says that these two concepts of title and ownership can exist simultaneously, so that there isn't either one or the other. Just for example, right now the Crown owns all land, so the Crown title is there, even though private property owners have their fee simple ownership. The Crown has the underlying title, so that Aboriginal title is just in another layer of that. So it's not going to affect the everyday property owner, and these are not the people we're trying to seek land back from. Land back is from these large industrial defendants that are, and all of the lands that we've chosen don't have any infrastructure on them whatsoever. So it's not going to affect the everyday citizen of New Brunswick. And this is going to require some time, some understanding, and education as to what does this mean and how is this going to affect me. And we really want to do what we can to assure the citizens of New Brunswick that this isn't going to affect them at all.
Right. My understanding is New Brunswick is a small province, but of course has some very big companies, being like Irving, one of them, with some very big holdings. So that's kind of what's played into this, from what I understand. But we'll have to end it there. But thanks very much for joining us again today, Chief Bernard.
You're welcome.
After the break, we'll talk to Northern NDP MLA Leroy LaLiberty about Saskatchewan's speech from the throne. Welcome back. The Saskatchewan government released its speech from the throne this week. The speech highlights the government's priorities for the next term. The Saskatchewan Party was re-elected to a 5th straight term in October. The priorities listed in the throne speech include improvements to healthcare, education, and public safety. Noticeably absent from the speech is any mention of Indigenous people or Northern Saskatchewan. Leroy LaLiberty is the NDP critic for First Nations and Métis relations. He joins me today from Regina. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Mr. LaLiberty.
Hi there. Thank you.
So I guess I would start off in terms of Indigenous priorities in the North not being mentioned, of course, in the speech. What would the NDP like to have seen in the throne speech in those areas?
Well, when they did the throne speech, there was no mention of Northern Saskatchewan whatsoever. This government is forgetting that Northern Saskatchewan is a part of this province. We've been neglected for far too long. It's 17 years with the Sask Party government, and we're still lacking the services needed in the North, in the Indigenous community. We haven't had any proper services that were delivered to the North, and it seems that it's going to continue to be that way. And so it was upsetting, not only for myself, but also for my coworker there, Jordan McPhail, for the Cumberland constituency, because we both represent Northern Saskatchewan.
Right, and I did notice one of the things that the speech did say was that the government plans to be kind of more representative and responsive to the public. Certainly the NDP, of course, didn't win the election, but they gained many more seats than they did in previous elections. So there are obviously changes around, and the government's been around a long time now. Did you see any signs of that in the speech, that the government plans to be just on a wider scale, more representative or more responsive to the public?
Well, it's the same old Sask Party. It's been the same. There wasn't anything that was really mentioned or changed when it came to healthcare or education. The North is rich when it comes to natural resources, but yet we're lacking the services needed for the community members that live in the area. So when it came to both the healthcare and education portion of it, there was just no mention of delivering any types of money for Northern Saskatchewan.
I have noticed in some of the previous speeches, although Indigenous people maybe have not always been a focus of the government's throne speeches or as they laid out their agenda. There has been a lot of talk about economic renewal in the North and things like that, and bringing Northern people into the economy, Indigenous people in the economy. I guess a bit surprising on that too, that there wasn't any talk even of a government that puts the economy front and center, that there was no talk of maybe economic reconciliation.
Well, and that's just it. There was, like I said, having them in government for 17 years, there hasn't been any type of proper consultation with the people of both Cumberland and Athabasca, and that's where a lot of the natural resources are being pulled out. And for money to be coming out the way that it does from the north, and no services going back in, it's quite frustrating for a lot of the people that live in the area that are affected by that the most.
Right, and I guess now the throne speech is kind of a map of what the government plans to do over the next few years. So it's usually quite general. So there's lots of areas, obviously, to change and for improvements. What you have your short first session here of the new government coming up. What are some of the issues, maybe Indigenous issues, that the NDP plans to press the government on, and where they would like to see Northern priorities and Indigenous priorities maybe met?
Well, my responsibility as the representative of Athabasca is for me to advocate for our people in the north. And I'm sitting in caucus with such a great team, a lot of people that really do care about the people and who they represent. We're going to push the government hard to make sure that they take full responsibility for a lot of the things that have been happening over the past 17 years. We're going to collaborate to make sure that we deliver the best for the constituencies in which we represent. We did take a lot of seats, and they had a little bump in the road there with having a Sask Party representative over 2 years, but we managed to get that seat back, and so it's my responsibility to advocate for those people in the north, and that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Okay, well, for time purposes, we'll have to end it there, but thanks very much for joining us, and lots of changes in Saskatchewan, so I'm sure we'll be in touch again.
Well, and again, with my responsibility as the Shadow Minister for First Nations and Métis Relations, my responsibility is to develop those relationships. And, we're definitely going to come back strong. And that's what we pushed on, it being stronger together. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And like I said, we're going to push this government hard, and we're going to make things happen.
Should be interesting, and we'll be watching. Okay, and thanks again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.